The Memphis Grizzlies just lost to the worst team in the NBA, and Steven Adams said they can't use playing on a back-to-back as an excuse. So I'm going to tell you why he's right coming up on Locked On Grizzlies.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, DeMichael Cole, beat writer for the Commercial Appeal, covering your Memphis Grizzlies. I've been covering the Memphis Grizzlies since December. This is my first season covering the Grizzlies, but I am a Memphis native and have been around the Grizzlies pretty much my entire life. But thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day. And remember, Locked On Grizzlies is available free and available everywhere you get your podcast. That's including YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and the list goes on. But today's episode is brought to you by Bet Online. Remember, Bet Online has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, where the game starts. But today I'm running solo. My co-host Sean Coleman, who most of the viewers may be familiar with, is on a well-deserved vacation. Sean has been doing great work with the Locked On Grizzlies podcast, and today is my very first episode as the co-host. So I'm looking forward to getting Sean back and us running this ship together. But let's talk about this Grizzlies team. Sunday, it probably wasn't as exciting as some people expected. A lot of Grizzlies fans, I know you're Tigers fans as well, and the Memphis Tigers got Sunday off to a great start, beating down on the Houston Cougars in college basketball and kind of solidifying themselves as an NCAA tournament team. So it was supposed to be a double dab of beatdowns on Houston, but it didn't turn out that way. The Grizzlies' second night of a back-to-back, we're going to talk about that a couple times throughout today's episode, but it was the second night of a back-to-back, and the Grizzlies went into the Toyota Center in Houston and lost to the Rockets. It was the Rockets' just 16th win of the season. The Rockets entered that game having the worst record in the NBA. The Rockets entered that game on a 12-game losing streak. So, they say the NBA is where amazing happens, and count, the number 2 seed in the Western Conference losing to a team on a 12-game losing streak as amazing. A lot of things went wrong for the Grizzlies. A lot of things went right for Houston, but that's neither here nor there. The first thing that we have to point out that went wrong for the Grizzlies is the shooting. It's been a problem throughout the season at times, and it's going to probably determine how far this team goes this season. Shooting. Because in the simplest form, shooting is the most simple thing about basketball, right? You shoot it in front of the line that's far away from the goal, then it's 2 points. If you shoot it behind that little circular line there, you get 3 points. And you shoot the free throw, that's 1 point. So shooting is, it's the simplest form of basketball, but it's also so complicated because you can see players have hot games, have cold games, and teams have hot games and cold games, and that's the Grizzlies. That's the Grizzlies this season. I think now if we just go back over the past few games, the Grizzlies shot 19% from three-point range against Houston. Before that, against Orlando on Saturday, they shot 41%. Everyone had it going. You go back a game before that on Thursday, they only shot 33% against Boston. You go back a game before that against the Spurs, they were shooting it well again, shooting at 42%. And you go back one more game before that, they shot 30% from three against the Bulls. So it's kind of a good game, bad game, good game, bad game. But you need to build consistency in the shooting department And this game against Houston was a pretty good example of that. And as I said, we're going to mention, this thing about this back to back. And, Steven Adams said they can't use that excuse. And I asked him about that. I also asked Ja Morant after the game, and Ja Morant straight up said that. He said, look, he didn't have it. He said the team didn't have it, and he's got to play better. He of course, like a young leader would do in the NBA for the most part. He took accountability. He took blame. He said he's got to be better, and yeah, he does. He scored 22 points on 7 of 20 shooting. Not Ja Morant's best night at the office for sure, and it's not too many games where Ja Morant is the third leading scorers for the Grizzlies. Steven Adams actually had 23 points, and Desmond Bane led the way with 28. But speaking of Bane, he was the one constant from a shooting perspective. Bane got it going early. He got it going, all throughout the game. And if there is a good part of what went wrong in the shooting, it's seeing Desmond Bane get it going. The Grizzlies, outside of Desmond Bane, shot 1 of 17 from three-point range. 1 of 17 from three-point range outside of Desmond Bane. Desmond Bane made 4 3-pointers on his own, and he scored 28 points. So Desmond Bane, he needed that. He has been struggling, and that if you go back to that game against Boston, that's when things really turned around for Desmond Bane. Desmond Bane came out of the All-Star break. His first 3 games, shot 4 of 19 from three-point range. And, you almost wonder, like in baseball where they say the home run derby is tough on players, because you go to that home run derby and you're swinging the bat and you're swinging for the fences and you come back into a slump. You wondered if the three-point shootout in a way had some type of effect on him, but he shot 4 of 19 coming out of that game. And then you go to the Boston game. I believe Desmond Bane started off 1 of 6 in that game on Thursday, and it was like, oh boy, he's really struggling. But he came out of that game, shot really well in the fourth quarter of that game, and I believe he was made 4 3-pointers in that fourth quarter. And in the Orlando game, made 3 of 6 3-pointers, got it going again. So Desmond Bane has been a real big reason why this team has shot the ball well. But outside of Desmond Bane, 1 of 17 from three-point range. You're not going to win a lot of games like that, and it's a tough strategy. Ja Morant didn't have it going from three-point range. Jaren Jackson, the list goes on. DeAnthony Melton, who he's taking shots confidently. Tyus Jones, who just had a great game, against Orlando. He led the bench in scoring, but even he didn't shoot the ball well in this game. So a lot of Grizzlies struggled, and that's become a theme so far. Whereas Desmond Bane is your guy who's shooting over 40% from three-point range, you have a lot of other guys who just aren't shooting as well. And John Conchar, for example, is a guy who shoots the ball really well, but he just doesn't take the same amount. He doesn't have the volume of shots as a guy like Desmond Bane. And you have, a guy like Zaire Williams, who, as a rookie, Zaire Williams struggled in this game against Houston, 2 points. I believe he only played 18 minutes. And this is coming after in the Orlando game, Zaire Williams knocked down 2 3-pointers in 1 quarter, and they were pure net. So sometimes he looks really good from three-point range, and sometimes he looks really bad. That's just the identity of this Grizzlies team. We talk about how shooting is going to be a big determining factor in how far this team goes, because that's what they need the most. And we saw, for example, in that Boston game, Boston went under the screens for Ja Morant, which led to him taking a high volume of three-pointers. I believe the Grizzlies took 40 three-pointers in that game. And, they had to, because Boston was basically telling them, we're going to go under these screens and we're going to force you to shoot these three-pointers, and we're not going to let you just drive to the basket easily. So that has been a problem most this season, all season long. The shooting woes, they're coming and going. The Grizzlies have a good shooting game. They have a bad shooting game. You just wonder, when you get closer to the playoff run, you have players who can return, and you have players who, may return to form, a la Jaren Jackson Jr., who's having, a career worst shooting season from 3-point range. You just wonder how those things are going to go in this last stretch. But there's a lot to take away that's good. Desmond Bane, I think, shooting the ball well. Ja Morant, even though he didn't have it, in this game, Ja Morant has shot the ball really well as of late, as he went on that torrid stretch coming out of the All-Star break with those 40-point games. So I don't think the shooting is a lost cause at this point, but at the end of the day, it needs to improve. And one of the guys who you want to see that improvement from is Jaren Jackson Jr. And Jaren Jackson Jr., this game, he only played 13 minutes. So we'll talk about why that happened. But first, let me talk to you about Built Bar, because milk brownie, coconut almond, it really doesn't matter. Built Bars are replacing candy bars as a healthier option, and they're just as tasty. Half as many calories and just as much chocolate. Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. So you should do it. I mean, you should go to built.com, use the promo code LOCK15 and get 15% off of your order. So go to built.com, use the promo code LOCK15 and get 15% off of your order. So yeah, Jaren Jackson Jr., 13 minutes and 5 fouls. So you wonder, just with the ineffectiveness of Jaren Jackson Jr.'s and foul trouble. This is not something that's new. Jaren Jackson Jr.'s biggest question, coming out of college at Michigan State in his 1 year was fouling. How can he stay on the floor? He's always been known as a shot blocker, as a 3-and-D, stretch big who can really shoot the basketball. And all those things have been proven in his NBA career. But one thing that he has not disapproved was the fact that he had trouble committing fouls. And we saw it in this game. Jaren Jackson had 2 fouls in the first quarter. Then he came in the second quarter, picked up his 3rd foul. Then he came in the fourth quarter, in the third quarter, and picked up his 4th foul. Then he came in early in the fourth quarter and picked up his 5th foul. Taylor Jenkins really didn't give him a chance to pick up the 6th foul. So, I asked Taylor Jenkins after the game, why did he pull Jaren Jackson Jr.? Because the Grizzlies decided to close the game with Brandon Clark, who, they've always closed games with Brandon Clark for the most part, and Kyle Anderson, because Jaren Jackson Jr. just wasn't as effective. That's what Taylor Jenkins said. His ineffectiveness, he couldn't stay on the floor and get in a rhythm, is what Taylor Jenkins said. He used the word rhythm, and as pertaining to Jaren Jackson Jr. And if he's not able to get on the rhythm, he didn't see a reason to play him. And that's not surprising coming from Taylor Jenkins. I did see some Grizzlies fans who didn't agree, with the decision. You may not have agreed with it, thinking, Jaren Jackson Jr., he's been, one of the better players for this team all season long. He's been one of the better defenders. Sure, he wasn't in a so-called rhythm, but maybe that fourth quarter would have been his spark to get going. And on top of that, he had only played 13 minutes. So we're talking about a back-to-back. So if anyone had even anything close to fresh legs, it probably would have been Jaren Jackson Jr., considering that he had only played 13 minutes through 3 quarters when he's usually, playing a lot more than that. But Taylor Jenkins, didn't go with him because of the rhythm. And as I mentioned, this shouldn't be a surprise to you as a Grizzlies fan when we're talking about Taylor Jenkins and rhythm. He's a field coach, and personally, I'm a big fan of coaches who coach more on field than going into games with implanted strategy and saying, hey, this guy is going to come out at the 3-minute mark of the first quarter, then he's going to enter at the 6-minute mark of the second quarter, and this guy is going to come in at that point and this point. No, we've seen Taylor Jenkins, go with Ja Morant for an entire third quarter and then turn around and say, Ja Morant play the entire fourth quarter too, if he really has it going. But we've also seen him, go with Tyus Jones to close the third quarter, and Tyus Jones really has it going. And he says, I'm not taking Tyus Jones out. I'll bring Ja Morant in beside him, but I'm not going to take him out. And so forth. He's done it with the bigs. He's done it with the wings. We've seen DeAnthony Melton close games. We've seen John Conchar close games. We've seen Zaire Williams close games. It all depends on the field when it comes to Taylor Jenkins. And that's what he did with Jaren Jackson Jr. It's just a bigger player. So, of course, it's more noteworthy than him going with John Conchar over Zaire Williams, which he recently did, coming out of the break in that Timberwolves game. So, Brandon Clark, he has been great for the Grizzlies. He's been one of the more consistent players, I think, on this team. Kyle Anderson was really impactful defensively in this game against Houston. And quite frankly, the Grizzlies didn't have a lot of impactful players on the defensive end in this game. So you look at it from that perspective, and you also have to factor in, Steven Adams with his 23 points and just his physical brand of play. He started this game off, really solid. So once you factor those guys in the way that they played, and you factor in that Jaren Jackson, 13 minutes, 5 fouls, you can't really blame Taylor Jenkins for that decision. Now, what could have changed? A lot could have changed. A lot could have changed in that game. The Grizzlies, they led through the first 3 quarters against the Rockets. And I believe the Rockets took the 83-82 lead with 2:27 left in the third quarter. That was the Rockets' first lead of the entire game. So the Grizzlies, they were looking like they were on pace for another wire-to-wire win. And if you go to that fourth quarter, because what happens in these type games is you play with fire, you eventually get burned. The Rockets aren't, some great shooting team, but they have talent. They have Kevin Porter Jr., who is, a really talented young guard in the league. They have Jalen Green, who was just a top pick. They have Christian Wood, who, played great in Detroit and earned that nice contract that he got with Houston. They have some nice, young, talented players. And what happened in that fourth quarter was those young, talented players, they came to hoop. And it was all she wrote. Because over 4 quarters, it's hard for them to sustain that type of play. It's harder for them to sustain it. But you, like the Grizzlies did, you lead for 3 quarters, for the most part of 3 quarters, and you allow this team to get back in the game. The Grizzlies led by as many 13 points. They got back in the game, and they closed. Jalen Green got all in his bag. The step backs, Kevin Porter was shifty and getting to the rim, and Christian Wood was active. He made a couple 3-pointers. That game was a classic example of one of those games where you wondered if Jaren Jackson wasn't in foul trouble, what type of impact could he have made? Personally, I would have put him back in the game. I would have, but like I said, Taylor Jenkins has established himself as that type of coach to coach off a field. So no one should really be surprised at seeing Taylor Jenkins, make that move. But you see, Jalen Green taking Grizzlies off the dribble and getting to the rim. You see Kevin Porter Jr. taking Grizzlies off the dribble, getting to the rim, kicking it out to open shooters. You wonder if Jaren Jackson was in the game. Do those wings for the Grizzlies come down as far because they know they have that shot blocker there who can help when, Jalen Green gets past Ja Morant. So you have Jaren Jackson Jr. behind you, who is the NBA's, total blocks leader by 20 blocks. He has 20 more blocks than anybody in the NBA right now. But yeah, Jalen Green got to the rim. Kevin Porter got to the rim. Stopping the ball was a problem for the Grizzlies. And I would have risked that, hey, let him pick up his 6th foul. Jaren Jackson Jr. is one of those guys who can change shots, who can block shots, and he covers some ground. And the Grizzlies weren't out of the game. It was a close game down the stretch, but the Rockets started to pull away in the last 4 minutes as they made big shots just by creating open shots, by beating guys off the dribble, and just not being afraid to go at the shot blockers. So Jaren Jackson Jr. Foul trouble is it's the one thing that's hunted him in his career. He has done better this year. We need to acknowledge that his foul percentage is at a career low. as compared to his first 3 seasons. We have to acknowledge that at one point in January, going into the last game of the month, he had more blocks in January than fouls. So there has been some progression there, but he is not to the level of consistency where Grizzlies fans may want him to be, where you may want your starting power forward who's getting, paid the way he is to be going into the playoffs. So there's a lot there to do with Jaren Jackson Jr. But we're going to talk about one of the guys who can help the Grizzlies fix some of these defensive issues or fix some of these, shooting issues that we talked about. But before we get to that, Bet Online. I mean, Bet Online for these games coming up Monday. Go check out betonline.net because there are some interesting NBA odds for Monday. The Lakers, they aren't as big of a favorite over the San Antonio Spurs as you may expect, and the Bulls. They aren't getting much love against the Philadelphia 76ers, which may be surprising to some, being that the Bulls, just a couple weeks ago, they were the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference, but the Sixers are that new trending team, and the Sixers are more than 7-point favorites on Bet Online right now. So go check that out, and not only just NBA, you can go to Bet Online and they'll have you covered with hockey. They have you covered with boxing. They have you covered with some of the biggest UFC matches coming up and much more. So head over to the website to learn more on Bet Online. So, I mean, the Grizzlies, there is a solution, I believe, to the issues that we just mentioned. We talked about Jaren Jackson Jr. and his foul trouble and how he could have fixed certain things. And one of those things was, the Grizzlies weren't able to stop the ball. And that's not a new problem for them. And not only that, we talked about the shooting. The Grizzlies haven't shot the ball, 19% from three-point range against the Rockets. A lot of room for improvement in the shooting area. And, the one player who didn't play in this game, who hasn't played since the All-Star break, who's actually only played a quarter and a fourth since the Grizzlies have taken off to new heights, and that's Dillon Brooks. Dillon Brooks is a player that the Grizzlies need, and he's a player that they want back. He kind of interrupted the Bally Sports broadcast, the pregame broadcast before the game to let them know it's almost that time. He's getting close, and that basically confirms the message that we in the media have gotten from Taylor Jenkins, who has said that 2-on-2, 3-on-3. Taylor Jenkins has said that Dillon Brooks is doing that. The last step for Dillon Brooks is 5-on-5 and more contact. So he's done some contact off to the side, but now he has to do contact with the team. And once he does that, he's clear and he's going to be ready to go. So from the shooting perspective, Dillon Brooks, you're talking about a 35.1% career three-point shooter. The Grizzlies, they're in the lower third in three-point shooting this year. They're in the lower third in free throw shooting. Historically speaking, if you go back throughout the 21st century, only one NBA franchise, just one, in the Western Conference has won the West. That means has went to the NBA Finals with numbers comparable to the Grizzlies when it comes to free throw shooting and three-point shooting. So the Grizzlies are an anomaly in this area, and the chances of them getting to the NBA Finals it's tough with these numbers. The Lakers are the only franchise to have done it in the 21st century. The Lakers did it a couple seasons ago when you had Anthony Davis, you had LeBron James, and that group. But they also had 3 seasons during the Shaq and Kobe era where, Shaq's free throw numbers kind of, skewed things when it came from the free throw shooting perspective. But three-point shooting also wasn't the biggest strength for those teams. So Dillon Brooks, he's the guy who can help the Grizzlies, because at this point of the season, you have to be honest with yourself. You have to say, look, the Grizzlies have played 60-plus games. the shooting numbers are what they are. Ja Morant's not going to wake up, start shooting, 50% from 3-point range tomorrow. Or, Steven Adams isn't just going to discover a 3-point shot tomorrow and turn into a stretch five or something like that. Those guys, their numbers are going to be what they are at this point. Dillon Brooks, 35% career 3-point shooter. Free throws this year, he's at 88. He's at 88.9%. He's at over 80% in his last 3 seasons. That's another stat. As we just mentioned, the Grizzlies are near the bottom of the league in free throw percentage. Dillon Brooks can help this team win. A lot of people talk about, his shot selection and who he's going to take shots from. And for example, we're watching Desmond Bane getting back going. And a big part of Desmond Bane's game is when Ja Morant goes out of the game and Desmond Bane runs with the second unit, he becomes that number one option and he does damage. He gets the mid-range jumper and Tyus Jones really finds him and he has a role there. But when Dillon Brooks gets back, Dillon Brooks will probably run with that second unit some too. Or Dillon Brooks, when he's in the starting lineup with Desmond Bane, he may take some of those shots. How will that affect Desmond Bane's play? But you don't worry about that as a coach. These guys have played with each other before. They've played with each other for a while. But the big thing is you want to incorporate Dillon Brooks, and you want to do it fast. Taylor Jenkins mentioned, before the Boston game that time is ticking. He said at that time, the Grizzlies only had 19 games remaining, and they know that when it comes to Dillon Brooks. They know the process to incorporating him needs to be quick. It needs to be, you don't want to rush things, but there is a sense of urgency, I feel like, when it comes to getting Dillon Brooks involved. And we talked about the shooting, the free throws, but I think the biggest area where you get Dillon Brooks at and he makes an impact is defensive intensity. And that comes especially with stopping the guards. So let's since the All-Star break, we don't have to go back too far to prove this point. The first game out, D'Angelo Russell, he went bonkers on the Grizzlies in the fourth quarter. The Grizzlies could not stop D'Angelo Russell, and they blew, a 15-point lead and lost that game. Next game, you played DeMar DeRozan. Actually held DeMar DeRozan in check. Let's be clear here that DeMar DeRozan entered that game scoring 35 or more points, shooting over 50% in 8 consecutive games. But in that fourth quarter, DeMar DeRozan really got it going. And Kyle Anderson stopped him on the final possession. But you wonder, again, Dillon Brooks is there. Does it even get as close as it did in the fourth quarter? And just going on and so forth. We talked about, this most recent game, Jalen Green, Kevin Porter Jr. for the Rockets. They combined for 53 points. 53 points from the backcourt. And you can't help but think Dillon Brooks would have got one of those guys. And especially Jalen Green in the fourth. Jalen Green, it's all there. He has the step back. I think he's a really exciting young player. He has the side step. He's explosive. He got to the rim on Ja Morant a few times and got around him and just exploded to the rim. He's an exciting young player, but you wonder if you had a Dillon Brooks to body him up and use that size, because Jalen Green he's kind of small right now. And, Ja Morant is small in his own right. He's not the type of guy you expect to body him up in that way. And Desmond Bane has the bigger body to be able to do that. But you don't expect Desmond Bane to be as shifty from a agile perspective to stay in front of Jalen Green the way, those guys would be able to. But Dillon Brooks has both of those traits. And he would have fared off better. So defensive intensity, the shooting, the free throw shooting, each of the areas we have seen the Grizzlies become, weaker in this season and throughout the break are actually the strengths of Dillon Brooks. So it's an interesting thing, because if Dillon Brooks comes back Tuesday, do you start him? Do you bring him off the bench? I, for one, think that the Grizzlies will start him solely for the fact that there's not a lot of time left. Zaire Williams has been up and down. He's had some really good games, but we also just mentioned that he had 2 points in 18 minutes in this game. That's not starter production, and Dillon Brooks will give you starter production. Even when he has those nights where fans are mad at him for some of the shots he takes, and you look up and Dillon Brooks is 6 of 19 or something of the sort, you'll be able to point to his defense or him diving on the floor for a loose ball or something of that sort as a reason to why the Grizzlies were able to hang around in the game. But as always, we thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day. Tomorrow, we're going to take a look at a very encouraging stretch coming up for the Grizzlies. So I'm DeMichael Cole, but now make your second listen Locked On NBA. Locked On NBA is where experts will be covering the biggest stories around the NBA Monday through Friday in less than 30 minutes. So you'll get everything around the NBA and you'll get it fast. So it's free and available wherever you get your podcast. Once again, we thank you for tuning in to Locked On Grizzlies, and come back again with us tomorrow morning. And we appreciate you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day. I'm DeMichael Cole, and we'll see you again on Locked On Grizzlies.